Welcome to Bonn Park.
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 Welcome to Bonn Park. I'm Sarah Geidlinger. Happy Earth Day, everyone, and happy birthday to my husband, Steve. He likes to brag Earth Day is my birthday. I hope you have a great day. This is week 5 of introducing the podcast without Marshall Ward. He says hi and hopes you're all well in maintaining social distancing to help beat COVID-19. If you're an essential worker out there keeping us fed, safe, and alive, I think I speak on behalf of our entire community when I say thank you. So Marshall's actually a backyard ornithologist and photographer, and I sent him a photo of a robin nesting in the window of our studio here this morning. I'll post it to our social media for you guys to see. If you have any wildlife making their own communities in your yards or gardens, post a photo to Instagram and tag us at Bonn Park Podcast. We'd love to see what's happening around you. Okay, on to today's guest. Our guest today is Pete Gray. He's a vice president and senior hydrogeologist for MTE Consultants, Inc., a leading provider of engineering services in Waterloo Region. He's going to talk to us about rocks, really. Not just that, he'll tell us about groundwater, geology, protecting the environment, and how he's helped shape education surrounding that with the Waterloo Wellington Children's Groundwater Festival. He's also going to talk to us about a different type of rock, the kind he plays with his Beatles cover band. We couldn't think of a better guest to help us celebrate Earth Day than Pete Gray. Here he is. So Pete Gray, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, me too.
How did you and Pete meet?
Well, actually, we met at my secret day job. I know normally people have secret night jobs, but I have a secret day job working in the world of engineering at MTE Consultants. I usually call myself a CAD monkey, but I know my official title is a CAD technical practice leader. Yes,
yeah.
Very fancy.
It is.
And Pete has a much different job than I have.
Yeah, I want to hear all about it.
Yeah, so I initially harassed Pete to come on the podcast because I'm super interested in what he does. So you are a senior vice president of MT Consultants, but you're all of these wonderful other things, such as a geologist, right? Scientist?
Yeah.
And what else?
A dad.
Oh, that's the most important job.
Most
actually.
important.
Yeah.
And my job isn't what I use to define me. I think it's what I accomplish through my work with serving people that really, when I describe who I am and what I do, for my clients, I help them solve some problems that they've been stumped by or they need help with. So I think I'm a good listener. My years as a scientist, so I'm in the work that we do, you have to be licensed like a doctor. So engineers have to be licensed. So do geoscientists or geologists. And that's really my formal training. I've been sworn in as an expert witness in hearings as a professional geoscientist with expertise on hydrogeology. And that's my expertise. That's the study and the movement of water beneath the ground, something that we can't see. So it kind of falls in. Everyone says, oh, yeah, all you do is geofantasize.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. I think that this hydrogeology stuff is so interesting. It's so exciting. Any of the people in sort of my area in civil that I've talked to, when I ask them to define hydrogeology, I usually get an answer like, well, it starts with rain. And then we get into some serious rock talk. So if you could explain to somebody who has no idea what you're talking about, what hydrogeology is, how would you put it?
Well, I'll start with geology.
Sure.
And that's the study of the earth, made up of rocks and minerals, and it has structure and shape. And then we have rain and snow that falls on it. The rain and snow that stays on land surface is the expertise of hydrology, surface water, and that sort of thing. But hydrogeology is then the study of the water that gets into the ground and seeps down into the layers beneath the ground and then moves through the ground because of gravity and other pressure, and then sometimes comes out of the ground as surface water. So it does start with rain, but really it starts with the rocks.
Starts with the rocks.
Yeah.
And in Canada, I think most people, when they think of our water, they think of lakes and rivers and pristine,
Yeah, and that's a real struggle when it comes to water supply, because 94% of all of the fresh water is groundwater. That's water we find under the ground, not on the ground surface, which that means that 6% of 5% of all the water then is either wrapped up in the lakes or in the ice. So there's a misconception about a shortage of groundwater and that sort of thing, but politicians sometimes see the solution to our water supplies to go to a source that they understand and they think they can manage, which is a Great Lake. London used to be on wells, get the water out of the ground like Kitchener-Waterloo. And they abandoned that and get their water from Lake Huron. But if you think of eco-security, those are very vulnerable, precious resources.
Why is Lake Huron like a vulnerable, precious
All of our
resource?
surface water sources are. I mean, in the cases of impacts to the atmosphere, let's say from a super volcano that might erupt at Yosemite Park. So that's a massive, there's different, as a geologist, I love volcanoes and earthquakes, but there's different kinds of volcanoes. In Yosemite, there's a super volcano that's much different than its neighbor down the road a bit, which was Mount St. Helens. So Mount St. Helens was really a baby volcano. This super volcano, if it ever erupted, it would cover the entire northern part of the U.S. and part of Ontario, including our Great Lakes. So that wouldn't contaminate our groundwater necessarily, which makes our surface water sources quite vulnerable to something like that.
And when you're talking about a span of time in the future, that is something that could happen. It is something that the lake is vulnerable to.
Yep.
So you mentioned that KW gets their water from the ground, or the K-dubs as I like to call it. Not a lot of people know that. That is surprising information for most people that I bring it up to, and then I feel super smart, and then they ask me to explain it, and I can't. So welcome to Bonn Park, and you can explain more of it to us.
Well, we're the largest metropolitan area in Canada that relies on groundwater. We have something like 130 some odd municipal wells that are 12 inches or so in diameter and hundreds of feet deep in some cases, that draws water out of the ground and supplies that. Now, the region, in looking at their long-term water supply strategy, wanted to make that system more robust. So they've looked at the Grand River and they've said, well, that floods. It has a kind of a base flow, a lower level of flow that we have to maintain. But there are times of the year where we could take that extra water out and treat it and put it back down into the ground, because the earth is really a big sponge, and then draw on it when we need it.
So are we talking about maybe like 2 years ago there when the Grand went a little crazy in the spring when there was a thaw? Like, are you talking about those big rushes, or are you talking about just like certain high levels of the year?
The region is a real leader in artificial storage and recovery, which is taking the water out of the river. And there are peak flows that happened primarily in the spring, starts with the spring melt, and then dies off as the summer goes on. And it's during those peak flows that they take that extra water, treat it, put it in the ground, and then pull on it through wells. But at that point in time, that surface water has now become groundwater again. So it's really, it's a sophisticated process in understanding hydrogeology, how much water can the ground store, how easily does it give it up, how do we manage or keep that balance so that we don't take out too much? And there are places around the world where it's called groundwater mining. Mexico City is the best example, where they've taken out more water than recharges every year, and the land surface has actually dropped 10 meters or something like that. And that's called subsidence or subsidence, where the water that was at one time holding the soil up by filling the pore spaces has been removed, and the soil's become compacted and the ground surface has actually shrunk. Las Vegas has experienced that, other places around the world too. So we have an abundance of water here. We get about a meter of rain every year, and about 50% of it goes back up into the atmosphere through a process called evapotranspiration. So the water evaporates from the lakes, and then it transpires from the trees and plants. So that's about half the water. And then of the remaining half, it's split in half. So about half of it goes into the ground, and about half of that flows overland to support our lakes and streams and rivers and stuff.
So where in the world is there not groundwater?
I mean, if you go to a lake and it's on a beach, and you're a few feet off the beach, and as a kid we all dug holes in the beach, and I marveled at, why does water come into the hole that I'm digging? Well, that's groundwater. So we encounter groundwater everywhere. In Region Waterloo, where we've got sand and gravel and clay on the surface, we don't have to dig down too deep to find it. In other parts of the world where the bedrock is on the surface, the movement of water happens through the cracks in that rock. So you may not be readily available, may be deeper, but there's really groundwater everywhere. I mean, with the globe being 2/3 water, there's a water table pretty much everywhere. It's shallow near where we live, and it can be really deep in arid areas too.
Yeah, I was picturing like an outport in McCallum, like a rock basically, or a desert. Or I guess groundwater doesn't apply to Antarctica, I guess.
Well, it would, but it's
Because the ice?
yeah. Well, there's still groundwater.
Yeah.
So in Canada, so if you think of it, the groundwater temperature in Florida is about 20 degrees Celsius, and that's because the Earth is an insulator. But if you come up to Canada, where the temperature changes significantly, we see our kind of average groundwater temperature at about 8 or 10 degrees. And again, that's because the Earth is this great insulator. But if you think of other places in the world where it's really arid, and these deserts still get rain, the water still makes its way into the ground, makes its way through the ground, and expresses itself someplace. So that's what an oasis is. It's where the ground has captured that water, and it's moved slowly through the ground, and it expresses itself as a spring. And a spring is something very basic. It's just where groundwater comes out of the ground. Nothing magical or mystical about a spring.
I'm thinking of my uncle right now. He lives up in the Kawarthas, and he gets his water at a spring.
Yeah,
he takes his truck out with his glass containers, and he fills them up.
Where is he?
Balsam Lake,
Okay.
Rosedale,
Yeah.
Highway 35.
I have a cottage right kind of near there on Stony Lake, a little bit to the east.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, you mentioned the public. Really, the public is just misinformed or not informed, not intentionally, but the water, once it hits the ground and goes into the lake or whatever, or disappears, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So we don't think about it.
The average person is, no, I'm generalizing. If you're all out there really smart, kudos to you. But
Yeah.
I think the average person is thinking, it's raining, or this is good for my garden. Not much, free car wash, not much more than that.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about something really important, which is what you're doing to change that by educating children.
Yeah, I have a huge passion for kids. I have four. My wife and I.
4 kids?
We have 4 kids.
Oh my gosh, good for you. I'm bowing to Pete right now.
And when I was a student in high school, my grade 9 teacher, geography teacher, Bruce McMillan, captured my imagination with his amazing drawings of geologic processes and rocks and stuff, glacial features. And I knew from then on I wanted to be a geologist. So we would go to this cottage, and I just loved the rocks and the trees and the lakes and stuff. And I also, as a boy, loved going on field trips. So never did I think I would be involved, let alone kind of spearheading an opportunity to have students across the province go on a field trip. So, I mean, this started in 1993 when I was working on a project in Cambridge, and my client had a spill, and we were retained to help clean up that spill. And I was dealing with the league.
I just want to interrupt because people might not know what a spill is.
It's the release of a chemical into the ground that is not intentional. They lost a chemical called methyl ethyl ketone or MEK. is used as a degreaser on machines.
Okay.
So it's part of the industrial process. This spilled, we got hired to clean it up. And in doing so, we found other contaminants, which is not uncommon. So this site happens to be near the Grand River and near a well field that supplies half the water to the city of Cambridge. And we learned that they were going to be fined. So the team approached the Crown and said, well, can we take that money and put it to an environmental cause? And the Crown said, that's a great idea. We've never done that before. What's the cause? So we said, can we get back to you? Mm-hmm. So I had friends in the U.S. and had been investigating, and I had learned that there's this thing called a Nebraska Children's Groundwater Festival. So in 1993, 4 of us went down to Nebraska, where we went to a college campus, and they had about 1,000 kids come that day, go into the main gym, and in the gym there were, 20 or 30 different activities where kids could learn and take part and get wet and kind of play with sand and water. And they called that a water festival, a groundwater festival, because in Nebraska, they also rely on groundwater. So we came back and thought, well, can we put it on our own? And approached the Crown, and they thought, sure. So we put our first one on in 1994, not ever having done this before, taking this great idea and making a Canadian, and where we went from what we saw was 1 day to 5 days. Each day we would have 1,000 kids. And we had reached out to our friends in the groundwater community and education community. The first festival was done at the Agriculture Museum in Milton. And friends from the now Concealing Regional Museum, they were involved as really instructors and helping us pull off an event.
Yeah.
So,
you might have the content, you might have the story, you might be ready to tell it, but sometimes you need somebody to to guide the way as to how do you pull off an event like that.
Right. So right? I was this young idealistic hydrogeologist thinking, wow, we're gonna have a field trip. We're gonna have kids come to this place, and they're gonna learn. So we had the University of Waterloo involved and the health unit. So once we started talking about this, people are starting to shake their heads saying, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. How do I get involved? So we pulled the first one off, and we all looked at each other and said, well, should we do it again next year? And there was no formal kind of group or body, so we created one and had our second one in 1995 in Milton. And then our friends that have come to it are saying, well, can I have one in where I live? Mm-hmm. So we said, sure. So in 1997, 4 started. We expanded from Milton, and we ended up in York and Durham and Waterloo. And each group started to create their own their own type of thing. We developed the idea to have high school students come as part of this and become instructors for us.
That's the whole key right there.
Right.
You get all the ages involved.
So now we're not just dealing with kids in grades 2 to 6. Mm-hmm. We're having high school students come and do the teaching. So
and get their volunteer hours.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's important as a high school student to have an opportunity to get out there. And so it's a field trip for them too. So the idea has just expanded, and we had created a charitable non-for-profit called the Children's Water Education Council. Mm-hmm. And there are now, this year there will be water festivals in 30 communities across the province.
I read that. I thought that was pretty amazing.
And yeah, it started with a great idea. And
started with a spill.
And a spill, yeah. So we took an environmental issue and we turned it into something very positive, where now we say that we've had kids that have come. I dragged my oldest there when he was 4. Mm-hmm. So he came with the school. He volunteered as a high school student, and he has volunteered since. And we've had others come and go to university, take environmental type schooling, whether engineering or geology or environmental studies or geography, whatever, and come back and sat on our steering committee. So we call that our own version of the water cycle.
Oh, it is. It's a beautiful thing. Right?
Yeah, and these things now run themselves. So in the beginning, I was on the committee, on the steering committee. And then when I came to Waterloo and I helped start the one here, I had been the chair a long time. And succession is an important thing to think about. So now they call me the honorary chair because I've stepped sideways, still involved, actively involved on the team, but letting others lead it. And I think that succession is an important thing for anything to succeed and to live a long time. So coming into 2020 will be our 25th year in the region.
Oh, that's great.
Which is an amazing thing when I think about how, the longevity of a non-for-profit and bringing people, like-minded folk. And I think it's survived so long because we've kept the main thing, which is educating kids about water.
I wanted to get into that little part there too about storytelling.
Yeah.
We were talking about that when you came by my desk the one day. And I was talking about, I think I was off on a tangent about how storytelling can be lost in our digital age. And not to use the term, but there's a lot of fake news and fake information. My kids often come to me with a fact and I'm like, no, that's not what happened. Let's find out for ourselves. But that storytelling that you're talking about, starting the kids young, and then some of those kids who go off to high school are probably coming back and volunteering, like you said, and there's that whole life cycle of its own happening within your festival. I think we've lost so much storytelling in so many parts of our lives, but water is one that is desperate to protect.
It is.
And it's amazing work you guys are doing. We've been to the festival. The kids are hands-on. They're wet. They're dirty.
Yeah.
There are physical activities. There are brain activities. Marshall, have you been to this thing?
No.
Well,
so this year you're coming.
Yeah.
Okay, you got it.
Yeah.
Well, Marshall is also you are the chair of
The KW Bilingual School.
Bilingual School.
Nice, yeah.
So you guys should talk.
No kidding.
Yeah. Just for the education purpose alone, and again for that storytelling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I was gonna say was, when I go each year to the Paris Fairgrounds, to the Paris Gem and Mineral Show, I can see that there's an interest there from people of all ages, even though the people from, I guess it's called the Brantford Lapidary, is that the word? Society, I kind of run it. It really, like you said earlier, captures the imagination of people of all ages. Unlike some things, like I understand, like a stamp collecting show, it's difficult to get younger people into that hobby. And anyways, I love this idea of just keep it out there.
Well, yeah, when it comes to rocks and minerals, so I've been on the Earth Science Museum advisory board for a number of years, and that group goes to these gem and mineral shows, and they have a booth, and they bring rock samples where kids can either scrape away limestone to find a fish within a layer. Yeah. So
fun.
It's really fun. Or
they're a geologist for the day, right?
Yeah, and learn how
mining for fossils,
how to pan for gold.
Yeah.
So I think the action. I think experiential education is something that we've really focused on, learning through doing. I think our schools, because of just the rules and regulations or whatever, I think the standard way of teaching isn't for everyone. It wasn't for me, and that's why I love the whole field trip thing. So whether it's a gem and mineral show, I'm glad there are people that intentionally make spots for kids to come to, because I think if you capture someone's imagination and then you give them opportunities, then the creative part in them will lead them on a journey. And I think it's that journey that's amazing, the journey of discovery and learning something that they had no idea about, that they didn't even think or imagine. So when I talked earlier about the public not really understanding water, they haven't had an opportunity. It's something that as a geoscientist, I only interact with the public in public meetings or, at a hearing, and that's kind of an adversarial time. It's not an opportunity. But when the Groundwater Festival happens,
this is the time to geek out and have fun.
Yeah. We can interact with, because as the ratio of parents or supervisors to class to students is about 5 to 1. So if we have 50 kids there, we've had 10 adults. So when I talk about over, the 27 years of Groundwater Festivals, we're pushing almost 1 million kids that have gone through these water festivals, but also several 100,000 adults. So
I was moved by the festival.
Yeah, we don't want the message to be lost on kids. We've learned that the average level of understanding scientific principles in an adult is at about grade 4 or 5, and that's the same level that we're teaching. So when they come to these activity centers, whether you're, looking at fish or whatever, it's right up the adult's alley too.
Yeah. I have in my home a small chunk of meteorite from the Canyon Diablo.
Yeah,
in
cool.
Arizona.
Wow.
And something people ask me when they see it in my home, first of all, they touch it and they're like, wow, it's kind of cold. And then it shows the minerals that are in it. One of them, I guess, is it called taenite? Taenite?
Yep.
Yeah, something like that. And they often ask, well, how does a geologist, without destroying it, can they tell what's in this? Can you answer that for me?
Well, there's some rocks that we've already destroyed. And we've run different types of tests. We've looked at them under a microscope. We've identified the minerals in them by shining light through them it's called a thin section. We take the rock and we cut it in a real thin layer and look at it under a microscope, shine light through it so we can identify what it looks like.
So it's a visual thing, like you.
Yeah. But that's all supported by someone already having taken it apart.
Right. Gotcha.
So while you don't have to look at it,
Yeah.
Every mineral, I could say quartz, but quartz presents itself in many different ways, from amethyst,
Not
right?
just countertops?
No, not or countertops to different. But there are some minerals like galena, which is a cubic kind of silver looking lead based mineral. There's nothing else that looks like it. So there's some minerals that are so unique. Mm-hmm. It's like, I know you would know that you see one.
Yeah.
The next one is it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's an educated
Yeah.
answer. That's why you're the geologist.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important to be able to try and explain things in a way, like we're sitting here at a kitchen table talking about, maybe some difficult things. But I think if we talk about it in layman's terms, and I teach geology and hydrogeology at Fleming College, and on the reviews after the students have taken a class or a course, some say that I'm too academic, and I say, well, I think I'm too academic because there are just words that I use that I can't think of another word to take its place. Mm-hmm. And that's a tough thing about science. Any kind of science, it has its own language, has its own way of coming together. When I think about water and I think about a term called hydraulic conductivity, there's no other way I can use to describe the movement of water through the ground other than hydraulic conductivity, or another one called transmissivity. So these are just academic words. So the tough thing in the public is talking about scientific principles and using layman's language. So that's why I like to tell stories.
Yeah. And about that storytelling, like I think what it all comes down to is me and Marshall talk a lot about community. And I kind of believe that although I can be a bit of a hermit, like community solves most things. Getting involved in your community, creating a community, reaching out in your community, lending a hand in your community, all of those things, I think are the answer to most of the world's problems. Mm-hmm. And storytelling, I think, is such an important part of that, because I think that it creates respect. So you think about in a family, grandparents pass stories down to parents, pass them to their children, and then to the younger siblings and on to their children. And just from that storytelling and you all sharing some common knowledge, there's respect for that chain back up in your lineage, right? Mm-hmm. And the same thing goes for water. Like, kids turn on the tap, water comes out. Aren't we lucky to have it,
Yeah,
especially in KW.
And then one day you don't, because the city turns it off, and it's like, what do we do?
Didn't you check the letter on your report?
Yeah.
No.
So you go to a restaurant and you say to someone who's serving you, so where did this water come from?
Mm-hmm.
The tap. Yeah. No, it came from someplace before that. But yeah, the whole, I think, storytelling thing has been lost as we've moved into the modern digital age.
It's changed.
So it hasn't been lost, but I think the sitting around a kitchen table, I mean, none of us have our devices out. No. We aren't tapping on anything. We're engaged. We're looking at each other. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the important part of community.
And I think especially when you're talking to kids also, because just as parents even, sharing that information with your children, and even if you didn't have a groundwater festival and you sat your 4 kids down and said, hey, this water is something we really have to respect, and here are the reasons why. And, it's all we got. These are the only reasons why. That alone would be important. But you're doing that with, what'd you say, 1 million kids so far?
Getting there. Getting there.
Yeah, getting there.
It'll be exciting when we... I think we're at about 60,000 a year
That's amazing.
So I think our stats a couple of years ago were close to 800,000.
Do you talk about E. coli and bacteria and how these
Yep.
things happen? We hear these things in the news all the time.
And when we get scared.
Yeah,
Don't eat lettuce.
don't buy this lettuce. But I don't know if people think too much beyond that. Oh, E. coli, okay, that's not good.
Well, it kind of comes back to my comment about surface water. In 2000, when Walkerton happened,
Yeah.
it happened in May, and the Groundwater Festival was on here in the region of Waterloo. So, and I was at the museum, and someone came up to me and said, Pete, CTV's going to be here at noon. You're doing a live interview on national TV about water because of Walkerton. I said, okay. So I met the guy who was going to interview me. Yeah, pressure. David Emery, great guy.
Yeah.
He's part of the community. So I had met him before. He said, listen, these are the questions we're going to kind of go over. And I appreciated, that I had a heads up of where it was going to go. And he genuinely wanted to know, like, what's going on.
How did this happen?
He
What are your
wasn't,
answers?
he wasn't there to stump me or anything. So we had a really good conversation. And I remember one question is, so now that Walkerton's happened, what are you doing different? And I said, well, David, we're doing the same things. We're talking about groundwater and surface water, talking about things like E. coli. We aren't specifically talking about Walkerton, but Walkerton is a place where it's a small community, 6,000 people or so, and they rely on groundwater. So they have wells, and the treatment of the water supply. So in Canada, we treat our water with chlorine, and while some don't like that because it gives it a smell, all you have to do is put it in the fridge for a little while, and the chlorine comes out of the water, but it's killed the bacteria. So we have a high safety regard. So the treatment system hadn't been maintained in Walkerton. And then they had kind of the version of the perfect storm where the wells are old, the casings, which there are regulations that say how deep the steel casing has to go into the ground and has to be cemented in the ground.
Oh yeah, you're a well
Contractor,
also.
yeah.
So
So
well contractor.
There were issues with the construction of the wells, and not too far away was a farm that had agriculture on it. So now this is talking about really we should keep our animals and our waste away from our water supply. So there was a massive storm. There was some waste. It moved over land. It got into the fractures and cracks in the ground some distance away from the wells and made its way into the wells. And
that's all it took.
yeah, 2,000 people or so are still sick, and 6 died. And from then on, Canada was on the map because of E. coli. Now, we find E. coli and other kinds of bacteria really everywhere. And that's one of the issues with the surface water source. We have to treat all of it because it's going to have this bacteria in it. So I'm still an avid canoeist, right? And I love to go in the bush as a geologist and canoe. Doesn't matter where I go. I'll never just take my water bottle and dip it in a lake and drink it thinking,
I didn't even do that as a kid.
yeah,
no.
oh, it's pristine. Well, you have to remember the atmosphere is the thing that carries all these contaminants, bacteria and whatever, and it falls to the ground by rain. And so you can't escape the bacteria. So yeah, it's definitely something we struggle with. And we live in a really a pristine environment where our streets are clean. I've been to Bangladesh and other countries where it's the exact opposite, and where really humanity in this case, when I was there in 2000, looked like it had overrun all of the resources. So, the contact with contamination was very present, was very kind of in your face, as opposed to Canada, Ontario, Waterloo Region, where we live in a pretty pristine environment.
Having said that, Pete, I have a memory. I was a kid in the 70s, and in the summer we'd go up to Owen Sound. I remember getting to Owen Sound, and there would be this rotten egg smell that was putrid. And I remember asking my mom, what is that? My mom would say, that's the water, right? But don't say anything when we go into the relative's house. And you go into the house, and the house reeked of, I'm being kind when I say rotten eggs. And
I know.
I never had any understanding beyond the fact that it was the water.
Yep.
So
what's the deal?
Well, yeah.
I want to guess it's sulfur.
Well, it is.
Yeah?
It's a bacteria. So it's a
Okay.
sulfur bacteria. So the rocks that we have in Owen Sound up the Niagara Peninsula and under southern Ontario were all deposited in an ocean environment like the Caribbean. And there were times when plants and animals will die and sink to the bottom and would get covered. And as the millennia has passed, they've eroded and decayed, and some of them give off gas. So these rocks have become full of water below a certain level, and some of that decaying matter has created gas that becomes dissolved in the water. And when that gas, or when the water can be released from the rock through a well, or the rocks actually intersect the lake, some of the rocks, there's a really cool, unique feature called karst. Karst is here's a technical word, dissolution of the rock by the water that's moved through it. So the lake water's moved into it, or it's rained and snowed, and the water that sinks into it dissolves some of the rock through, like if it's moving through a crack, it dissolves the rock in that crack and makes the crack bigger. That's how we get caverns forming. Anyway, when that happens, the gases can be released too. So yeah, that is a naturally occurring thing, and it can be very localized. You can have one neighbor have this issue with a rotten egg smell, and another one that doesn't have a problem. So often it's related to certain level or layers of the rock that are rich in some of these things.
And is it something that can be resolved? Is it something where it lasts for a period of time and then it somehow sorts itself out and it goes away? Or
well, it's as big as the resource is.
Yeah.
So
So big.
Interestingly enough, the whole discovery of oil and gas and the development of the oil industry started in Petrolia, Ontario, Canada. We were the first ones to drill wells into the rocks, and we found oil. It's not Judd Clampett and the down in the south. It happened here in Ontario, and you might think that's a great legacy, but the problem is that was a long time ago, and those well casings are eroding over time, and some of those gases are coming up to the surface and impacting the shallow water supply. So what comes with it is that odor too in places. So yeah, it's the release of the gas that builds up. Now, you've heard probably about fracking, where there's layers of shale, and these shales are or ocean bottom types of rocks.
And they have oil in them?
Because they had plants and animals and things that would have died and become buried, and massive forests and that sort of thing. That's where we get coal that's created. Anyway, the way to, we know that it comes out of the rock, but the rock is sometimes hard. It's hard to let it go. So we use pressure to help, and that's what this fracking process is. Oh. So it's a very natural thing that the gas is becomes volatile, becomes out of solution or out of the liquid into the air again. But we use pressure in some cases to help increase that process so that we have a huge abundance. So when you say, it could last more or less forever because these deposits are massive in some cases.
Do you have a much better understanding than most people regarding the possibility of water on a moon like Titan and like space science I'm talking about, obviously? Do you have, because of everything you've done and specialized in and know, when astronomers or space scientists come forward with there's possibly water on Titan, right? Do you have a pretty good idea of what that all means?
Sort of.
Yeah.
It's a long way away, and a lot of this is theoretical. I've read things that even the huge craters on the moon aren't necessarily always the result of an asteroid hitting them, but they're as a result of electrical activity. So this other world environment is something that we try to take the things that we see and observe and test on Earth and apply to space. And I'm not sure that's always a linear application.
Yeah. One of the more fascinating things I love hearing about is how, so there's these little kind of micro living things living on the very, very bottom of the ocean, where it's unbelievably hostile, like incredibly hot and dark and dense. And I guess they talk about how if something can live down there, there's a very good chance it could live. Yeah.
And that's what I mean, where we take what we've learned here. So there are places on the bottom of the ocean that the crust is in the form of a volcano coming up out of the ocean floor and spewing not the lava onto the Earth's surface, but in the bottom of the ocean. So it's highly acidic. It's hot. As you said, it's a real dangerous and abstract type of world. And we still find life there. So
where somehow water and lava can coexist.
Intermix. Yeah. So we try and look at those processes and say, well, if it happened here, it must have happened someplace else. It's just difficult to collect real data,
Right.
from such a distance. So we end up using math and our other observation techniques to extrapolate what we know on Earth and think, so even in the rocks, we have a group of rocks that are called Precambrian, and that means before life, and they're from about 1 billion years and back. And then we have the other light rocks that are sitting on top of it that are full of life. So some are looking at some of these Precambrian rocks and wondering, is what I'm seeing here, is it actually life that existed, potentially that long ago? So it's a difficult thing to measure. Right?
I want to quote that Ringo Starr
Yeah.
saying, which is, that'll put you in your place. Make
Yeah,
you feel
no kidding.
pretty
Yeah.
quick.
Well, I think about Waterloo Region, how environmentally, I've been to much nicer places in the world as far as warmth and seasons go. But anyways, but I've always felt an incredibly, a real safety to here, meaning other than, I guess, maybe a tornado in Goderich years ago, right? Mm-hmm. I can't imagine an earthquake happening here. And this may be incredibly naive of me, but just it seems like we're in a pretty safe, stable place as far as the earth goes. I know the earth can do anything at any time, but is that how you feel about this
It
area?
is, yeah.
Didn't we have a teeny tiny earthquake?
We've had earthquakes,
About
and they're
6 years ago.
they're kind of classified as intercontinental or mid-plate earthquakes.
Yeah.
It was maybe one of the reasons why when I went to Indonesia after the tsunami in 2004. So I was there in May 2005 thinking, wow, I'm a geologist. I've never felt a real earthquake. And the first one we felt, I thought, okay, that's good. I don't need to feel another one. The next one was, kind of in the middle of the night on the only day we had off when we were there, trying to get out into the street in the nighttime. So when I think about home and I think about Waterloo Region, we don't suffer from many of the natural disasters that we see around the world. So the big storm that just hit the States, they called it a weather bomb. Yeah, by the time these systems pass through the Great Lakes and
we
come,
barely get a snow day by the time they get up there.
and come from the south, these Great Lakes have to our south and to the west have done a great job of buffering that, and that's where the most of our weather comes from. Now, fortunately, the precipitation still comes our way and hits the ground, as opposed to the effect of a mountain, out west, and they have on the inland side of it arid regions because the rain has already been taken out. But yeah, we get these massive storms that come across the continent, out of Texas or across the plains, and by the time they go over the Great Lakes, they're filtered, and we still get some, but.
Yeah, I talked to my daughters about this. I sometimes make a joke that we almost have a dome over us. It seems like whenever there is a imminent weather warnings coming, not a lot really happens here.
Just kind of misses.
I love a really, really good hard rain, but they're really few and far between here.
Yeah, I think the Great Lakes does a great job of sucking the energy out of these storms, and you see it on, let's say sometimes Buffalo, if there's a strong wind across the lake and Buffalo gets feet of snow, and on the north side of the lake there's nothing. Mm-hmm. So the lakes play a real important role locally, but even more regionally. And by the time we get to Waterloo Region,
I've seen on the news Buffalo's like, they can't open their front doors, and we don't have anything, like nothing, not even snow on the ground.
So it's not a dome, but it is kind of a protective barrier.
Yeah, almost like a moat.
And and most of our weather comes from the southwest. Our prevailing wind is from the southwest. And sometimes we get some storms from the north, but if you think of it, there's not a lot of you need energy to create a storm. Yeah, and it's colder to the north, right? Yeah. So our systems, we've got this massive continent and all this land in the U.S. and the sun and the change in temperature and pressure as it moves to the north, and then the lakes suck a lot of it out of it.
Pete, I'm going to ask you a question I've never asked anybody in my
Okay,
life.
great.
I can't wait.
Me either.
He's asked me some weird stuff.
Yeah.
What does an earthquake feel like?
Oh, that's a good question.
Like,
It kind of felt like the earth was, it sounds kind of weird talking, because I almost wondered if I heard the rocks. Like I heard it coming.
You're a rock
Yeah.
whisperer.
And I'm a rock whisperer. Well,
Like it's sort of like how wood or steel groans when there's movement.
yeah,
or,
the earth groaned,
Wow.
and then
Said Pete.
get the heck out.
I'm getting scared. Just
Yeah,
listening to
it's.
this.
I can't imagine.
Well, we were staying in these buildings that were beyond the flood zone from the tsunami. So we were about 6 kilometers from the coast.
That's still pretty close.
Yeah, but the earthquakes, are relevant. They can affect, and Indonesia is part of what we call the Ring of Fire that is around the Pacific Plate. Mm-hmm. Now this is, and Indonesia is one of the most tectonically active places on the earth. So I was pretty sure I'd feel an earthquake. And again, the first one I was in a building kind of like your house where the people had occupied, many of the buildings were destroyed. They're not built to withstand the power of an earthquake. So we were in a house, and this whole house was shaking. People were running, and I saw this look of fear in them, like it's going to happen again. And this is only months after. So the tsunami that was triggered on December 26th, 1994 was a magnitude 9. And there's only been a few magnitude 9s or greater, I think 3, measured on the planet. And the effect is almost felt across the world. So the ones that I felt were more like 6.5 or 7. But the difference between one and the other is tenfold. So I can't imagine what the massive earthquake would have been like. But
so, you see a bit of footage sometimes. Someone's inside their house and stuff's falling and stuff.
Yeah.
But you're feeling it in your feet and in your body. And,
in your bone, I felt it in my bones, and we were on the 3rd level of this concrete.
Like a rumbling.
Yeah, this concrete building. I was staying with a professor from Alberta, and we had a plan on how to get out, but it was dark, and we couldn't open the door. And I had this vision of, that's great, this whole building's going down. Now, I do know that most earthquakes last less than about 30 seconds on average.
30 seconds too long.
And yeah, by the time we got out, it was still going. And this rickety building and this wooden door, it was jammed, and we were pulling on it. So we got it out, and then we're going down this narrow concrete stairway, and I'm still thinking I'm going to be buried alive. And then we got out onto the street, and it wasn't until that time that I thought, okay, is it time to go home? And the weird thing is I had the luxury of knowing I was going home.
Yeah.
That is
Right?
something I didn't consider.
Leaving these people here that this is the world that they're going to be living in. Now, they've lived in it, but this was the first time that, the Southeast Asia had experienced a tsunami like that. Canada's experienced them too, but it's been a long time. It's kind of beyond our storytelling time. And in fact, it's really only left in the stories and in the rocks.
Right.
Right? It's not in our time. We've really only been monitoring and measuring scientific things for about 100 or so years. So if these things happened more than that, then it's stories. And in our First Nations, the stories have been passed on, and they would have a great recollection of it. But, in the developed world, where the stories have where our community fabric is different as opposed to the more organic type of communities, the stories are lost. So
they max out at about 100 years.
yeah, and I just saw the fear of people in their eyes that this is happening to us again. Because where we were, in the zone where we were, it was a tribal community, and tribes are set up, and there's a community in that tribe, and 1 in 10 survived. And then of the 1 that survived, 10 to 1 were men. Mm-hmm. Wow. So their whole fabric, social fabric, where I was in Banda Aceh, was gone.
It makes me think we live in a fantastic place in a fantastic time, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. I mean, we think about how tough it is. I actually love the change of seasons. I heat by wood in our old farmhouse, and
and you just said I could smell my family home.
yeah.
And we did too.
And you think about what that was like, but as we've developed and we've kind of fallen away from our connection to the city, or from in the city to the country. But I think, in this area that we live, we have got an abundance of water. Our weather's pretty good. Like, we get a kind of tease of great weather in the summer.
Yeah.
We complain if it's too hot.
Yeah, it gets real hot.
I tried so hard not to this year, but I complained a couple of times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, pretty blessed.
Yeah, we are. I want to talk about a different kind of rock.
Yeah.
Pete Gray's involvement in the Beatles cover band, Von Beats,
Yeah.
as a drummer. Tell us all about it.
Well, that was fun. The church that I go to, we had an event called Revolution. Mm-hmm. And it was an outreach event to try and help bring people into the church to get a sense that it's not all that they might think. Mm-hmm. So this play was about some people, and it happened in the time of the Beatles. So we have, I play with some guys at the church where I go to still now. I play the drums. And we said, well, one of the guys had this idea and wrote the script for a play, and we put the music behind it, and we did it in sets where the first one was the early days, and we dressed like the Beatles. And I think I'd said before that when you listen to, it's different being a tribute band than just doing cover. Because during, when you play cover, and I've played in bands and in bars, and we've done other people's music, they still compare you to Eric Clapton, and what he looks like and how he plays. But when you dress up as another band, and
we take it.
We're
in. We're all in.
Yeah, and your mind kind of goes to when you first heard that song, or when you think about it, and you kind of lose track of all the things. And then, you hear the music again, and we really focused on trying to nail the songs. I think we did a great job on the music, and some of the mannerisms of
the head
Ringo,
bobbing.
head bobbing and stuff. It was a lot of fun.
That's great.
I think about just the delivery of the vocals, Paul McCartney's "Hey Jude," just how you have to really get that right if you want your audience to buy it.
Yeah, and we had a left-handed bass player.
Oh no way, that's pretty good. And playing left-handed for Beatles, or actually was left-handed?
No, he is left-handed. That's and he
great.
Plays bass in our band, and he has the same Rickenbacker bass that Paul McCartney would have played on many of those early songs, and it was kind of cool when we did that.
When you talk about Paul McCartney's voice, my older daughter Justina described, we were listening to the Beatles in the car. I listened to the Beatles often, but when she was much younger, she described John and Paul as the soft round voice and the sharp voice.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, man, I never thought about it that way before, but it's so particular to me and specific that is what they sound like. John's voice is a harder, sharper sound, and Paul's is very soft and creamy and round.
Yes, creamy and round. Yeah.
What blows me away is the idea that Paul McCartney wrote Yesterday at the age of 22. I don't understand.
I thought that guy from the movie Yesterday wrote.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
Well, I have really appreciated the influence musicians have had on each other. So I watched just recently on Netflix a show about Woodstock, and it was kind of a back scenes of the festival, and it was, I didn't know that it was as peaceful as it was and how many people were there, but then it was followed by the next thing that came up was I think a show called Echoes from the Valley, and I'd never heard of it. There's a valley in California where in 1965, many of the kind of big guys of the music stage back then were playing, whether it was Eric Clapton, the Mamas and the Papas, Bob Dylan, Neil Young from Canada went down there and was part of that. Well, and then they're interviewing Ringo, and Ringo is standing there talking about the influence that he had, like how he was influenced by some of these guys, and they were talking about how the Beatles were influencing them. So I thought it was kind of cool that they included Ringo, because the Beatles were, a big deal.
Yeah.
And just how they would look at each other and how they were friends across the pond. So
I took
it's
a
kinda
course
neat.
in university called, I think it was called like Contemporary Music and Rock and Roll or something. Everybody wanted to take that course, right? And, I'd already knew about how influential the Beatles were in terms of like records like Revolver,
Yeah.
and Rubber Soul, and the role the Beach Boys played there.
Yeah.
But what I
Rubber
didn't,
Soul's my favorite album.
yeah,
Just
Rubber
fun
Soul's
fact.
incredible. What I learned in that course though was I didn't realize that the Beatles were the first to do this, where a song like She Loves You or Help, there's no instrumentation before, it just
Yeah.
Yeah.
right
The
it just
cold
starts.
open.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that nobody prior to that had
We're
had
doing
done
that.
that.
That's
Yeah.
why people were screaming.
Yeah.
It was like the new. I always talk about the new way music is written for Spotify or for streaming or whatever.
Right, yeah.
You got to get the hook in the first 8 seconds.
Yeah.
You make them listen for the 30 seconds, etc. They were doing it already, and they didn't even know.
They're getting the hook in the first second.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
It was you mentioned the hook. I look at it even when I talk about the things that I work on, my elevator pitch, and you really have 30 seconds to get your point across.
What is it?
Oh, it varies.
Okay.
It really varies
Yeah.
depending upon who's asking and what it is. But yeah, the music and I've struggled as I've gotten older to find newer bands that I can relate to and that resonate with me for a number of reasons. It's not that I'm stuck in the past. I just love music. And I love the ability that these guys had to create, and they were creating something that the world really didn't know. And that's where when I think about water, I'm trying to talk about something that our public really struggles with understanding. And admittedly, I do a lot of work in the aggregate industry. For my
Right.
clients have gravel pits and quarries, and I can't talk about this in the public. But the public has displaced priorities. So everyone wants to be green, right? They want to pay as little as possible. They don't want to create greenhouse gases. They don't want to ruin the environment. But if there is a resource close to them, they don't want it. Not in my backyard. For, dust reasons and trucking and other things. But as soon as I say I don't want it close to me, that means it's going to come from further away, which means it's going to cost you more. It's going to cause greenhouse gases. It's going to create the carbon footprint that on one side you're saying you don't want to have happen, but then you don't want to be able to support, this industry. I mean, that the resources are where they are. It's not like I can necessarily go a mile away. Oh, by the way, someone's probably going to live there anyway. So so we struggle with that in trying to strike the balance of being responsible and using the resources that are close at hand.
You
No,
just
that is a struggle.
masterfully just brought our conversation full circle.
Yeah, you really
I
did.
didn't mean to.
Yeah,
You did.
Can
He's
you play
done with
Can you
us.
play Octopus's Garden now for us?
Oh, that's
a great
good
song.
One.
Yeah.
What's your favorite Beatles song to play? Because I can't say I have a favorite Beatles song. Depends on the day.
Yeah, I don't know that. I just like the variety and the simplicity. I liked how with the Beatles, you didn't hear them count. I really am not a fan of hearing the drummer count a song in. But there's so many of these songs that, man, like you said, these guys started with "She Loves You"
Yeah.
together,
Yeah.
spot on, right? Or all these other songs. So I don't know if I have a favorite.
I couldn't either. I knew it was a tough question.
There's a couple songs that Ringo actually would put towels over his drums to have a muted sound.
Yeah.
And I would do that when because we really study these songs. I just loved how he was left-handed, but he was playing right-handed.
Yeah.
And which I couldn't do, I'm sure. And how he would be creative in making different sounds with the small thing that he had, small kit that he had.
I sound like
Anyway.
an old fogey here, but I talk to my teenage daughter sometimes about something will be on the radio, something that's like a song, like popular song. It's very braggadocious and how much money I make and all this stuff. I was thinking,
Braggadocious.
could you imagine if John and Paul ever sat there and said, let's talk about how rich we are and how many girls like we get and
I
stuff.
think it
Like,
would ruin the
Yeah.
ideal.
no kidding.
Anyway, I took us back away from the
Yeah.
180 degrees that it
You
got
did.
us to.
You
Sorry.
did. But thank you so much for coming. Pete Gray,
Yeah.
geologist, scientist, drummer. You rock.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Hey all, thanks for meeting us in Bonn Park. Please like, rate, and subscribe to our podcast on the platform that you're listening to. And follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Bonn Park Podcast. Original music by Alan Lung.